As the economy slips toward the abyss, people start plans to bring it back. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. Welcome back. It was a week of waiting to find out whether the virus is finally on its way out, waiting for economic numbers that we knew were bad and would only get worse. But at the same time, it was a week of hope as number of hospitalizations, at least in some places, started to go down. And we began to understand just how much help is being given to the U.S. economy and the global economy, including by G20 finance ministers who reached out to help the poorest nations in the world. And so we begin with some of that help, given in part by the Fed and by Dallas Fed President Robert Kaplan, whom we talked with and asked him whether his view about the U.S. economy has changed in the last 2 weeks.
My view is basically the same as it was 2 weeks ago. I think we're going to have a substantial contraction in the second quarter, and we've said publicly annualized as much as 25 to 30%, but again, that's annualized, so multiply by 4. We think we'll start growing again in the third quarter, and we will continue to grow into the fourth quarter. I probably would say today that peak unemployment may be closer to the mid to high teens, so maybe a little higher than I'd said before. And we still believe that we'll end the year with an unemployment rate something like 8 or 9 or 10%, but in that range. And the challenge going into 2021 will be to work that unemployment rate down.
So there seems to be a range of views among Fed presidents as well as the board, which is why you have multiple people, so you have different views and they're expressed. But if you take Mr. Bullard on the one hand saying it's going to be a sharp V, and you have Mary Daly now saying, boy, this could really drag into next year in a recession, where do you put yourself on that spectrum?
Here's the worry. Here's the challenge. Going into this situation, we had sluggish manufacturing, sluggish business fixed investment. Obviously, a lot of it had to do with weak global trade. But the one thing we had going for us as an economy is we had a very strong U.S. consumer. We had a low unemployment rate. Household balance sheets were in reasonably good shape. And that was 70% of the economy. The challenge is, as we come out of this later this year, and if the unemployment rate really is 8 to 10%, you're going to have a weakened consumer who's going to, you would think, save more, be more careful, be a little bit more reluctant to spend, and that's going to be a headwind for the economy, and it may take a while, and I mean into 2021, for the consumer to get his or her footing back, and I think that'll be dependent on how quickly we can run down this unemployment rate to lower levels. So do I think it's going to be a V? I think the consumer situation makes me think that we'll have a recovery, and it'll be a solid recovery in the second half of the year from the levels we're at. We're still going to have a 4 to 5% contraction for the year, but then the question will be, what's the pace of growth, and what's the state of the U.S. consumer? Those are the questions, and that's the issue I'm most worried about.
And the psychology of the U.S. consumer, it strikes me, is not simply being somewhat more conservative because they got burned in a downturn, but also being concerned about their personal safety. How willing are people going to be to go back out, even when they're allowed to do it, to go to restaurants, to go out and spend, to really participate in the economy? Will there be some reluctance just because of personal safety concerns?
Yeah, so there's 3 levels of issue with the consumer. One is personal safety, as you mentioned. This is why ubiquity of testing is so critical. If you had widespread testing at scale, I think that would do a lot to give consumers confidence to go into the workplace, to go out to restaurants, to go into other public gatherings. But that's very much dependent on how available is rapid testing. The other 2 issues are job insecurity. I just saw a survey from the New York Fed that said something like 70% of all workers are worried about their jobs, about losing their jobs. So there's that insecurity. And then the last issue is just what's happened to the consumer financially, and particularly that segment of the population, which is sizable, that doesn't have much savings and lives from paycheck to paycheck. And this is going to make it so they're even more cautious. So those are the 3 big issues that affect the consumer.
As we look at the models that you all run at the Fed, is it likely this pandemic will actually affect the potential growth for the United States? I mean, I think before it was probably around 2% more or less. Does this take that number down somewhat going out into the out years?
Yeah, it may, and so we'll have some snapback growth in 2021. We'll grow faster than potential next year. We'll grow at a higher rate. If potential is 2%, we think we're going to grow a lot faster than 2% because we're making up for what happened this year. But after you get into the future, there's two things that drive potential growth. One is growth in the workforce, and the second is growth in productivity. And the concern I'd have is you have a number of people that are going to lose their jobs and are going to have to find new jobs. Some of them who are older, it's possible will decide to retire, i.e., just withdraw from the workforce. Others will need to get retrained. Some will find it hard to find other jobs. So workforce growth, as we're running down the unemployment rate, you would expect a good rate of workforce growth. As we run that down, though, we had a workforce growth issue coming into this because we're aging. Demographics were such we already had a workforce growth challenge, and we're going to have to relook at that, and that means job training. It also means revisiting a sensitive subject, immigration, appropriate immigration, ways to grow the workforce, and then the second issue is productivity, and I've talked a lot about that here at the Fed. The U.S. going into this lagged the world in math, science, and reading. We ranked 25th out of 35 industrialized nations. And while we've beefed up skills training, we also are not doing it fast enough to keep up with the changes with technology and technology-enabled disruption. So, and you also worry about, will the level of government debt squeeze out some private investment in CapEx? So we're going to have to address all those issues, and I know we can, so that we can grow faster. But otherwise, yes, potential growth could slip. And we already thought going into this crisis, we were concerned that potential growth was going to erode over the years because of those drivers I just talked about.
Let's talk about specifically your district, because it's right in the middle of the oil patch. The oil industry is really taking it really on the chin right now. Give us a sense how you evaluate the effect on your district and the economy in your district, not just from the producers themselves, but also all the service providers and things like that. There's a lot of jobs involved in oil exploration and development.
So the oil business and related businesses is roughly about now 9% of Texas GDP. That might surprise people. But over the last 25, 30 years, the state has grown dramatically, and we've diversified into a number of other industries. But even with that percentage, 9%, this is as everybody knows, extremely difficult time for the oil business. Why? The price of oil is down dramatically because of oversupply, and it's not economic for a lot of producers to produce. So what they're doing is they're shutting in production. They're stopping production. You'll see a number of failures in the industry, and people just can't make it through this. And then for the service providers, they're obviously suffering because there's less production. And so we even before this crisis had expected CapEx in the energy sector to be down 10 to 15% this year. It's going to be down dramatically more, and obviously there's going to be job losses. The big issue in the short run, though, is even though when you look at your screen, you see the quoted price of Brent and WTI West Texas crude, the local price is even lower. And why? Because we've got so much oversupply, we're on the verge of running out of storage. And so if we actually fill up the storage where there's no place to sell the product, you'll actually see the local market prices being well below the quoted market prices. So that makes it even worse for producers, where they just can't make a profit at these levels. And that's where we are right now. Now, after we get people back to work and we start to resume appropriate consumption, some of this excess is going to take several months to work off and into next year, and then you'll get to a more balanced market. But right now we have an extraordinarily imbalanced market, and that even takes into account the recent deal between Saudi Arabia and OPEC+. It just wasn't enough to overcome the huge amount of daily oversupply we have right now.
That was Robert Kaplan, president of the Dallas Fed. Coming up on Wall Street Week, we talk oil with our contributor Afsaneh Beschloss of RockCreek Group.
If you assume that oil and gas are not renewable, in fact, it means that if you keep your stock and its value goes up over a very long time, it may not be exactly the most stupid program to have.
This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. Welcome back to Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. It was another week of bad numbers. Retail sales numbers, industrial output numbers, and those jobless claims as millions more Americans lost their jobs. We talked with Wall Street Week contributor Afsaneh Beschloss of the RockCreek Group, and we asked her whether we could be headed for a jobless recovery.
Well, it may not be jobless, but it will be at a lower level of employment than I think most people expect. What we're seeing is both the CFOs of the largest companies not seeing employment come back to quite where it was after this crisis, but also, as we've seen with the PPP and the programs for the smaller businesses, those businesses are finding that it has been very difficult to actually get access to the PPPs, which have now been all fully allocated. And unless we get another batch of it, it's not going to be very helpful. Plus, it seems like the market is talking about a lot of bigger firms having had better access to the PPPs than the true moms and pops or the smaller enterprises. So again, from an employment point, it's not clear either for the larger companies or the smaller companies that were hoping to get access to the PPPs, that their employment numbers will come up as we expected. The other thing that I think is worth looking at is that, for example, in China, what the government has done is actually just push out cash through Alipay to every Chinese person or most Chinese people. So you get a cash account on your Alipay and you can buy goods with it. You actually have to exit your home. You can't order online. You have to go out, and they're trying to get people to normalize behavior, to go out on the streets to buy a cup of coffee, to get a meal, and maybe even go to the movies or whatever. But we don't really have that. We're not really accessing the end consumer through the programs we've got in the U.S.
Afsaneh, you know a lot about oil and energy. That's where you started out as an expert in that area. What about this report that the government may actually pay oil producers to keep their oil in the ground, sort of have the strategic petroleum reserve reside in the ground? Does that make sense?
You know, it's cheaper to do that sometimes than storage, especially we're running out of storage space in the U.S., but also outside the U.S. So I think, you know, if you assume that energy is oil and gas are not renewable, in fact, it means that if you keep your stock and its value goes up over a very long time, it may not be exactly the most stupid program to have. It's not exactly a common plan that the DOE has had in the past. Most of the time, I think we have expected that our storage spaces would be available and be able to do the same thing as we're talking about. Also, because all the tankers that are out on the ocean are also getting full, and most likely by sometime in April or May they will be full. We might have to stop producing, in which case there will have to be some sort of program if we want to support the industry domestically. Whether this is the way to do it, or another way might be to help the companies with their credit programs and things like that, might be more sensible.
You mentioned the possibility of the employment situation not coming fully back. And you look at the oil industry, are we looking at the possibility of some long-term, even maybe permanent changes in the structure of the industry? For example, in the shale oil producers down in the oil patch, they are really hurting. I'm not sure they'll fully come back.
You're absolutely right, David. On the other hand, I think what we're seeing, which is very surprising, some of the numbers we've been seeing this week, in fact, is that renewable energy now has reached about just over 20% of our total power grid in the U.S. And in fact, the Lone Star states, Texas, is a hub of not just oil and gas, the way we think about it, but they have been building a quarter of all new solar capacity that has been installed in the U.S., which may come as a surprise to most people who think of Texas just as an oil and gas economy. So on the one hand, you see that employment in one part of the energy sector is going down, but the employment potential for renewable energy might be going up at the same time. And the question is, will the renewables survive and actually thrive as energy prices stay lower?
In a world in which we have much more renewable energy and less of the fossil fuels, does that require as much employment? Because we can see, for example, in the auto industry, electric vehicles don't require the same number of workers as internal combustion engines.
It might be that the cars themselves don't, but or they're manufactured differently. But at the same time, installing capacity, let's say solar on top of your house or in industries, it still is relatively, it does need labor, a different kind of labor, maybe trained in a different way. All the parts and all the services that you need for renewables also, or clean water or anything climate related also, will generate a lot of employment. In fact, as we speak, I would dare to say that the services part related to renewables is experiencing a problem with getting all the access to good labor and experienced labor, because we don't have that level of labor experience in services part of renewables and water and things like that. So there is a mismatch there, and if we can get our training programs up, we might be able to help some of this unemployment problems that we're seeing in the other parts of the energy sector. And I think I should also mention that in emerging markets, you're seeing the opposite trend, because a lot of them are energy importers. So just like in the U.S., we've become very, very strong energy producer, in a lot of countries that are energy importers, they will have the opposite experience, in the sense that as their economies start coming up, they will benefit actually from these level of low energy prices, and that will in effect help their unemployment problems in the longer run.
That was Wall Street Week contributor Afsaneh Beschloss. Coming up on Wall Street Week, protecting the most vulnerable among us from exploitation during this crisis. From Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey.
You see people out there on the internet, Instagram, Facebook, they're marketing coronavirus vaccines, treatments. All of these are scams.
This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. Welcome back to Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. We like to think that a crisis like the one we're in brings out the best in people, and there are plenty of examples of that. But unfortunately, there are also those who seek to take advantage. We talked with Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey about what she's seeing in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
A few things that we're seeing. One, you see people out there on the internet, Instagram, Facebook, they're marketing coronavirus vaccines, treatments. All of these are scams, and so in response, we go after them and quickly try to shut them down. We also see people who are setting up these charities where they pretend to be asking for support to support coronavirus victims, and again, they're scams. And so we're just encouraging the public to really do their homework before you ever give money like that to what you think is a charity. We've seen a lot of lately, a lot of people reaching out via phone call or on the internet, promising small businesses disaster relief and, pretending to help them with their application for that federal money, which people are so desperate for. And so we've been really clear with the public, only go through the public sites to apply for and obtain that relief. But it really runs the gamut. I mean, recently there was a woman named Suzanne, she called herself, who was calling around offering to help people with their student loans for a fee. So we're monitoring this. We're encouraging people to report these scams to our office, and we're taking action as we see it.
So do you have something like a hotline, Attorney General?
We do. In Massachusetts, we have a hotline set up. And we also have a way for people to file directly online or through social media with our office. So we've got those lines fully staffed up. We had to fight off unlawful debt collection, price gouging, that began a few weeks ago, and similarly for these types of scams.
If you discover these, what can you do about them? Your court system's closed down, isn't it? Can you take people into court?
Well, it really ranges. Some of this stuff is coming from overseas, so it's harder to chase. But, sometimes it's just a matter of tracking down who owns the site, calling them, sending cease and desist letters. We've had success doing that. We also make sure that we warn the public immediately so that they're on the lookout for these kinds of unlawful solicitations.
Look forward to a more hopeful time. For example, when we get a treatment or we get a vaccine, how will we make sure that people can afford it? Because unfortunately, the wealthy have the first access to these things, and yet a lot of the people, as I said, who have been most badly affected have not been the wealthy at all in most communities.
No, it's so true. And not only are they having trouble accessing health care, our whole healthcare system is so strained right now, and you see the holes and the failings there. But, remember, a lot of these folks are frontline workers, but a lot of these folks, too, have been laid off. They've lost their jobs. And so we're going to need a whole safety net and a whole lot of funding to support them and to help them through this time. And so, this isn't a weeks or months long endeavor. This really is going to take us, I think, years to recover from, to rebuild from. But, my hope is that we rebuild in ways that are more equitable, that deal with some of the underlying disparities that, result today in Black and Latino populations disproportionately being affected, sickened, and killed by the coronavirus. So we've got a lot of work to do. But with this devastation comes a lot of opportunity to rebuild in a more positive direction, I think.
Turn to a different issue, because up in Massachusetts, again, your governor, Charlie Baker, announced this tracking and tracing pattern with Partners in Health, really to try to isolate and identify the people who have the virus and might spread the virus. Does that raise issues for you in terms of privacy? Because we now see Amazon and Google, for example, are saying they're going to have an app up that will tell us who we've been in contact with. Do we have to consider that balance, or is this a bad enough crisis we say, look, we need to worry about saving people's lives. We'll get to the privacy later on?
Well, I think it is a matter of public health right now. That is the priority. That said, there is a way to do it to account for people's privacy. I think you need strong, this has to be government-led so that the right protections are made in place. But certainly whatever we can harness from the private sector, we should be looking to harness. And the fact of the matter is we're not going to see the economy open, as many people are clamoring for, until and unless we have measures in place to do that contact tracing, to test to see who has the antibody, and may be able to return to work to see who's had the virus, right, and who's come out of it. And ultimately, we do need to get to a vaccine. So I think people need to be patient. It's a terrible situation, I know, for everybody. But the fact of the matter is, until and unless we have these measures in place, we're not going to be able to open things back up. And we've got to get that right, and we've got to put public health as the priority ahead of everything.
That was Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey. Coming up on Wall Street Week, former UN Ambassador Samantha Power on American leadership in global health crises and whether we're up to it this time.
The United States has made no major new announcements about how it's really going to respond to the pandemic.
This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. Welcome back to Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. The world normally turns to the United States in times of global crises, but is the United States up to the task this time? Samantha Power spearheaded U.S. efforts to fight Ebola when she was UN ambassador, something she writes about in her memoir, Education of an Idealist. We talked with Ambassador Power specifically about President Trump's decision this week to stop funding the World Health Organization.
It's an extremely ill-advised move, and it has far more to do with Trump's domestic politics, I think, and his dipping poll ratings in terms of his handling of the crisis than it does the WHO and any desire to strengthen the global health response. 3/4 of U.S. funding in terms of assessed and voluntary contributions goes to such tasks as fighting polio, measles, tuberculosis. And so what he's eating into is steady state funding, the funding that the United States has been giving for many years. The United States has made no major new announcements about how it's really going to respond to the pandemic and how it's going to use the WHO and other international agencies to avert a humanitarian catastrophe in the developing world, and a catastrophe that, of course, will blow back to the United States because of our links through trade, through global supply chains, through family ties, and so forth, to even remote parts of this earth. So it's, I think, more of an act of spite and diversion than anything. That said, WHO has not performed, I think, optimally. I mean, there was too much deference to China at the beginning. I think that also speaks to the absence of U.S. leadership within the organization. The fact that China has been able to leverage a very modest contribution to the WHO speaks, I think, to the U.S. retreat from organizations like that. But the WHO needs to go back and look when the time is right and when it's not trying now to prevent millions from dying, maybe even the risk of billions being infected. I mean, there's 3 billion people in the world, David, who can't wash their hands at home, who don't have clean running water to do so. And so with all of these people at risk, right now the WHO is working on trying to ensure that governments in the developing world who don't have the kinds of cushions that we have, and we've seen our challenges managing our response, but who don't have stimulus packages or $2 trillion bailouts coming, impoverished communities, vulnerable communities, refugees. The WHO is out there and trying to offer technical advice as to how those communities can withstand what is about to hit them. And this will just mean that the WHO is now instead scrambling to figure out how it fills the gap that Trump is leaving, but also how it mobilizes the new funds it needs to really ramp up those efforts.
Ambassador Power, you make a very important point. You talked about being able to wash your hands, basic hygiene. You wrote in the New York Times recently about this great disparity, not just in the ratio of doctors to populace, but also, as you say, a lot of people around the world can't even wash their hands. So as much as we struggle with this crisis here in the United States, how much worse is it going to be in a lot of the lower income countries?
It's going to be devastating, I think, on both axes that we're experiencing, right? First, in terms of the lethality and the contagiousness of the epidemic itself. Because of close overcrowding and the close quarters in which people in poor communities often live, the ability to practice the kind of social distancing that we are managing, if we're lucky, in some of our neighborhoods in the United States, I mean, that ability is not there. And so when one individual brings the virus home, it's likely not only to infect whole families, but potentially whole neighborhoods, or at least whole city blocks or slum blocks. So if you think about refugee camps in Idlib or in southern Turkey, for that matter, if you think about the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh, but even if you think of the favelas in Brazil or the slums of informal settlements in South Africa or in India, I mean, it is just going to race through those communities. And then part of that health concern and the sort of ravaging of the virus concern is that the health facilities to manage the spread, to get people in early, to hydrate them, to put them on ventilators. I mean, these communities don't have ventilators. If we had trouble, getting masks and PPE for our health workers, you can imagine what a refugee camp is going to be experiencing. So that's in the health domain, what the virus does and how much more contagious and more deadly it can be because of the absence of proper health care. Then you combine that, David, with the economic toll, and we're experiencing that here. That's why so many Americans need desperately the $1,200 checks because they don't have another source of income, having been laid off. They have their families to feed. They have insulin that they have to buy for their diabetic children. I mean, that's in a developed country like this one, and we have had the stimulus package passed, and maybe there'll be more to follow. When that economic livelihood is taken away for families that are living hand to mouth, in those slums or who are dependent on international aid that has now dried up because it's being diverted to domestic response, you can imagine even the risk not only of malnutrition but of outright starvation. And you saw in Kenya this week riots already erupting because food has become so scarce, just not because yet of the virus wiping people out or the virus wiping out the local economy in Kenya, but because now the markets aren't available for the goods that were being produced in Kenya because the flights have been suspended, so there's no place, even if you grow the products, no way to get them, to market. And so already we're seeing that economic toll, and that's before this has really hit in the way that we know it will in the coming days.
That was former UN Ambassador Samantha Power. Coming up on Wall Street Week, we stay with the international response to the crisis and talk with the IMF's former chief economist about what the G20 did this week to help countries less fortunate.
The international response to the virus has not been well coordinated, and as you said, countries have basically, looked at their own needs and not really acted as if this is a global threat that has to be controlled globally.
That's next on Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. Welcome back to Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. G20 finance ministers this week agreed to suspend debt payments from some of the poorest nations around the world. We talked with the former chief economist for the IMF, now a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, Maurice Obstfeld, about why this is what was needed.
It's certainly a great help in the situation. The poorer countries are going to be facing an unprecedented health crisis and having to deal with international debt repayments at the same time when there are such great expenditure needs and resource needs, and their economies are in trouble would really be an undue burden on them. So, I think any sort of relief they can get during this crisis period is welcome. Yeah, at the same time, they will need additional resources, obviously, for meeting the crisis. And there are a number of proposals out there. One that we put forth was to have another issuance of the IMF special drawing rights, as was done in 2009. And certainly the resources of the fund and the World Bank will have to be fully deployed.
So you perfectly anticipated my question was, it's not enough to say you can keep the cash for the time being, you don't have to pay your debts, but they're going to need cash as well infused. And as I understand it, there is a proposal, is there not, for a special drawing rights issuance? And the report, actually, Mr. Lemaire over in France, was that the United States was resisting that. Is that consistent with what you've heard?
Well, we at Peterson have made a proposal. Others have proposed this. It's a fairly low-cost way to greatly improve the liquidity of these poorer countries at a time of crisis. And there have over the years been many criticisms of special drawing rights, most of which don't hold much water. So we think it's a step that would be pretty easy to take, and it would give these countries some unconditional resources that would have a high value to them in this crisis.
And we talked earlier, actually, with Ambassador Power, who talked about the fact that these less developed or poorer countries are going to have such a terrible time of it. At the same time, the developed countries are struggling mightily as well. Is the G20 doing what it can, or are there things it should be doing to try to really get the entire global economy coming back, including the developed countries? Well,
the stabilization efforts that the G20 countries are taking for their own economies, will certainly benefit and spill over to the emerging and developing economies. So that's definitely a good thing. But there's certainly much more that could be done, and some of these issues are in the realm of general financial support, but a lot of these issues are in the realm of pure public health policy. The international response to the virus has not been well coordinated, and as you said, countries have basically looked at their own needs and not really acted as if this is a global threat that has to be controlled globally. And you see this in the export restrictions on medical equipment that a number of countries have put in place, which are not only harmful to others but are ultimately self-defeating given global supply chains for these equipment. You see this in the way the United States has attacked the World Health Organization, which is exactly the wrong thing to be doing in the midst of a global pandemic.
Where should we look for leadership right now? Historically, people have looked to the United States in a global crisis such as this. The United States is consumed, in fairness, with fighting its own version of the coronavirus. But if it's not the United States, where will leadership come from?
It's not clear. I mean, over the last 3 years of the Trump administration, the U.S. has mounted a concerted effort, it seems, to weaken international governance rather than to pursue its more traditional leadership role in the global economy. So there is a big hole there, and I expect that in terms of supporting the WHO, for example, Europe will step up, China will step up, but this is far from an ideal situation. And what's clear is that the U.S., rather than providing leadership, is addressing its own internal political conflicts. Now, with fairness, it's not only the U.S. that has prioritized domestic concerns. I think if you look at China, their initial response to the crisis in terms of transparency with the global community leaves much to be desired, and that was also driven to a large extent by internal politics. So the U.S. isn't completely unique, but in the past it has been able to largely rise above domestic politics in the interest of its global leadership and global security, where there was a bipartisan consensus. And that now seems to be frayed, to say the least.
That was Maurice Obstfeld of the Peterson Institute and the University of California, Berkeley. Coming up, we wrap up the week with our special contributor, Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary. This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. Welcome back to Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. It's time now to wrap up the week with our special contributor, Larry Summers of Harvard. He is, of course, the former Treasury Secretary. Larry, one of the reasons why we value you so much as a contributor is that you are willing to change your views in the face of the evidence. There's been a fair amount of evidence this week. Have you changed any of your views about where we stand with this crisis?
I think this is going to be longer and more serious than I thought several weeks ago. That's because the data surprises were all negative, retail sales worse, industrial production worse, unemployment claims higher. That's because the problems in the financial system down the road from cascading defaults have come more clearly into view. That's because I have a clearer sense of the international difficulties and how they're not being attended to. And most importantly, with Singapore having to reverse itself and lock people up again, I've got a much greater sense of the complexity of any kind of return for the economy to normal conditions, and a sense that that's going to take a very long time. So my sense is that this is not going to be a V. It's probably not going to be all the way to being an L, and there may well be a W aspect in this recovery.
So, Larry, you talk about the complexity of getting the economy going again. What about the risk involved? Because you had a lot of talk from the president and others this week about getting us back to work. What are the risks in that? How do you assess that?
Look, all kinds of athletes have ruined their careers by trying to come back too quickly after injuries or after health problems. I had a serious injury a year ago. I wanted to try to go play tennis, go play golf. My doctor said if you do that, you risk re-injuring your legs and having to go right back to the beginning again. That's the way it is here. And I think if we go rushing back, we're going to be back to lockdown, and it's going to be much harder economically, psychologically, and politically than it was the first time. And so I think that would be a very serious error, particularly a very serious error if we don't have pervasive testing and contact tracing in place, and we're still moving too slowly on those things. So very often when you rush, you end up getting to your destination more slowly. And I'm worried that we're going to make mistakes in that direction. Look, if we go too fast, it's an irreversible error and we're back to locking up. If we go a little slower, then, and it turns out that we've overprotected, then we'll be able to fix that mistake.
So, Larry, you say that you think it's going to take longer and be more difficult, riskier, more complex coming back from this. And yet the stock market was up for the second week in a row this week. Does the market know something about this that you don't?
Possibly, and it's always a mistake to ignore the message in markets. On the other hand, the market had nearly half a dozen rallies of 20% or more between 1929 and 1933. The market had a major rally in the period after Lehman, before the collapse at the beginning of 2009. The market had several periods when it rallied during 2008 before reaching its bottom. So false dawns are ubiquitous in the history of stock market fluctuations. And I think it would be a serious mistake to take too much comfort from what's happening in the market, given all the difficulties that lie ahead in the economic forecast. I mean, think about it this way. It would be an odd thing if, well before the trough of a recession, that was the most serious recession by a factor of 3 in 70 years, the stock market was only down by 15%, and that it wasn't going to go down further as that recession took hold, particularly when there's news to come about relapses on the health side, about the difficulties potentially in the financial system, and certainly about what's going to happen in emerging markets on which many U.S. companies are very, very much depend on. So nobody can predict the stock market, but I think it'll be a mistake to read great optimism from what's happening in the stock market.
How much of the market is betting on the Fed? Because one difference from all those other recessions is the Fed has stepped up even more than they did back in the great financial crisis.
I mean, the Fed is providing very low, hyper low interest rates, so there's no place to go, other place to go to get yield. The Fed is supporting the borrowing of large numbers of companies. The Fed is injecting huge amounts of liquidity into the system. The Fed is literally buying exchange traded funds made up entirely of junk bonds. And many people think that at some point that if things were to turn down, that the Fed would be prepared to buy equities. So I think this is, you're right, David, this is very much a bet on what the Fed is going to do. And I think what we know from lots of financial history is that policy can rig markets away from fundamentals for a while, but it can't do that forever. And these fundamentals look pretty difficult to me. So look, I'm not here to give your listeners and your viewers investment advice, but I think anyone who thought that, oh, the stock market's up, therefore we can relax, in the midst of every serious recession in U.S. history, there would have been substantial opportunity to make that mistake. And so I don't think it would be wise to take any great faith from that.
Yeah, and finally, Larry, one of the things that's coming clear is, as difficult as it's been here in the United States, what some of the countries around the world, particularly the poorest countries, are facing could be much, much worse. What do you make of the G20 and their decision to suspend debt payments at least through the end of the year?
That was a good useful thing to do, but the really tragic truth about the G20 meeting was that the countries of the G20 have a philosophy: whatever it takes, break every rule, ignore moral hazards, massive deficits, massive liquidity at home, and crumbs off the table for supporting the international community. 6 months of a useful debt relief measure doesn't remotely approach what's necessary with respect to the worst global financial crisis since the Second World War. It was a vision-free G20. That is not the fault of the heads of the international financial institutions. That is the fault of the major shareholders of the international financial institutions. Frankly and sadly, it must be said, primarily the major shareholder, the United States. We should be doing everything, we should be doing equally shocking things to fortify the liquidity and the quantity of lending and the provision of funding from the international financial institutions and the providing for debt relief. We should be acting as far from the norms there as the Fed is acting, or the European Central Bank is acting, or the Bank of England is acting. And when we've done that, we will have had a global community response. But we are far, far short of that, and it's very sad.
Yep.
And the chickens are going to come home to roost. Yep. And frankly, it's a geopolitical big deal as well, David, because we've opened a door that China may walk through with catastrophic consequences for their relative influence in the world compared to us.
Okay, Larry, thank you so much. Thank you so much. This is Wall Street Week for this week. See you next time.